Okay. Today, we're going to talk about George Washington all day long. And that's appropriate because George Washington is the father of our country, right? And today is Father's Day, so we couldn't have made it any better in terms of timing. One of the historians of Washington's life calls him the indispensable man, the man by which there wouldn't have been an America, United States without. Most historians conclude that he was the one person who would, if he hadn't been who he was, we would have not survived. Why? Well, after the revolution, he had a great deal of legitimacy, right? Everybody looked up to him. He was the general that won the war. And who's a Washington person can tell me what he did in Annapolis once there was peace?
Resigned.
What?
He retired.
Yeah, he left. He came back and said, here's my sword, take it away, civilians. What did he do after he was president for 2 terms? He went home and retired and said, time for the next guy. He didn't try to keep and stay in power. He had legitimacy, a voluntary exit from power. History shows that seldom before did that ever happen. When the military leader, the president, the person who had power, voluntarily said, I'm done. It's okay. Somebody else can take over. When it came to the executive, he was not a follower of what they call today the unitary vision of the presidency, where the president had a lot of power. He was one of the people who helped write the Constitution, and there was a balance of power. And so he didn't push the executive. He also established a cabinet and said, hey, it's not just me deciding things. I'll bring in the smartest people I know, and we'll work together. He was the only guy who could have brought unity North and South together because he was respected by all. And he established all of the precedents for presidents. So that's why historians pretty much agree that he was the most accomplished. So we have a little chart here. You're going to tell me what you think and remember what were George Washington's accomplishments. What?
He was a successful farmer.
He was a great farmer. Yep.
He married Martha.
He was smart enough to marry the wealthiest woman in all of Virginia. He did not want to be king. He didn't think any one person should have the ultimate power. Surely you know more than that. He was a surveyor, yes. He wanted a lot of land west over the mountains. Well, here's a list. Military achievements, it wasn't for Washington, would we have won the revolution? Probably not. If you're a military historian, he followed what we call war of posts. In other words, as long as you keep the army in the field, you don't lose. So he kept backing up and going and fought very few battles. He lost more battles than he won. He was a natural leader. He president for the Constitutional Convention, managed to get everybody together. I know, we have people saying we ought to have another Constitutional Convention. Well, let me tell you, if we did, they wouldn't be able to agree on anything as far as I can see. So I think we better stick with the one we got. He had a lot of presidential accomplishments. He had a revolt out in the West, the Whiskey Rebellion. Those people who've ever been to Washington, PA might remember that. There was a whole lot of military accomplishments. So the big question that we have today, was George Washington a Christian? Take it away, Sue. You want to say something about that?
Sure. So we're going to talk about this during our hour here. So we want you to be thinking in terms of, was he a Christian? But let's just take a survey right now by show of hands. How many people think George Washington was a Christian? And how many people think that he probably was not a Christian? And how many people really don't know? You're all right, I think, all of those people who really don't know. So we're going to take a look at that right now. So we're back to you already.
I think, how do you decide whether someone is a Christian or not? How do you decide? Do they go to church? How they act, how they live out their life? They follow the words of Jesus and do what Jesus told you to do in life? Yes?
It's not really our choice to make.
Not, okay, a predestination person here. About what they say and what they write. Is that important? Well, I'm going to suggest to you that when you look at any of these people that we're going to look at in the next 3 weeks, that there is some difference between how they live and what they say and write down. Because you see, one of the things about these folks is all of them, the leaders that we call founding fathers, all of those people were very concerned about their legacy. Not whether they had a monument or changed the appearance of Washington, D.C. or whatever. They were concerned about what they said and what they wrote. And they kept every scrap of paper or letter they ever wrote because they were concerned about what you were going to think of about them. So we have a lot of writings and we have a lot of actions.
Thank you.
Which one is more important? Which one tells you whether they were Christian? Well, am I still here? Yes. Okay. As far as where did he come from? Came from a very strong Anglican Church of England background. For those of you who don't know, they're called Episcopalians today. Because they had to change their name after the Revolution because nobody wanted to be an Anglican anymore. But his great-great-grandfather was actually a preacher. I don't know whether you know many preachers' kids, but they come in two kinds. One are the troublemakers, and the others are the ones that live right after the vision of their parents, So you either become another preacher or you become a troublemaker, but that's off the side. But George Washington, in his early parish, he came from an Anglican family. He went to St. George's Parish for school, was taught by the people, ministers there, and he himself was very influenced in his early life by the church. So you're going to talk about the rules of civility.
So I've been told by maybe half a dozen people, maybe more, that you couldn't hear me when I'm speaking. So your job, if you can't understand me or can't hear me, is to give me the high sign, okay? All at once. But Washington came from what was considered respectable but minor gentry. So this is something that he strove to improve upon all his life. He always wanted to be among the gentleman class. At the age of 11, his father died, and his schooling ended very abruptly. So he may have attended, we're not sure, but he may have attended the grammar school associated with this church here that in Virginia, in the northern neck of Virginia. And he may have learned his basic mathematics and handwriting and those kind of things. Evidence of his abilities show that he had some early schooling. And this is probably where he learned that schooling. And it's St. George's Parish, would have been an Anglican church in Virginia. But at 11, his schooling ended abruptly. His older brothers, his older half-brothers, had been sent to England to receive a classical education, but that was not going to happen for George because he, being one of the younger sons, did not inherit a large inheritance. Instead, he continued to strive and devise ways to become part of that gentleman class. And one of the ways he did that was to study what was called the rules of civility in behavior and conversation and company. So what this was 101 maxims, if you will, of how you should behave in polite company. We know that he studied it and took it to heart because it was written out in the back of his grammar school notebook, probably sometime around the age of 14 to 16. He wrote each of these 110 rules out. And they included some things like rule number 1 was kind of the foundational rule. Every action done in company ought to be of some sign of respect for those who are present. So think about others. Some of them are very practical, things your mother taught you. Cover your mouth when you sneeze or cough, right? Some of them are show kindness, or about showing kindness. Don't show yourself to be grateful or glad when others suffer misfortune. And some of them are very kind of common sense. Think before you speak. If I had a nickel for every time my mother said that. One of the most famous and favorites are, when at table, don't pick your teeth with your knife. So there are 110 of them, but they would have been essential to a young man who was not going to receive that classical education in the polite company of other gentlemen. He was positioning himself, even then, to become a gentleman. So, I want to talk a little bit about his moral background and spiritual upbringing, some of the things that impacted him in later life. So he moved at the age of 6 from where he was born at Pope's Creek in the northern neck of Virginia to a place, well, actually he moved first to a place called Little Hunting Farm, and then to this place called Ferry Farm. That's where his father moved the family in order to be close to the iron works that provided a good portion of their income. So when his father died at 11, his mother, Mary Ball Washington, kind of took over his upbringing. He would have been the oldest of his father, Augustine's children. His 2 older brothers inherited the larger portion of the estate. He would have been the oldest of, I think there were 5 or 6 more, five surviving children. But his mother was a very strict and devout Anglican. So his world would have been centered on some of those Anglican principles: duty, self-control, submission to providence. So his mother would have been very careful to make sure that he followed those rules. She was reported to have been a little bit of a helicopter mother, a little bit of a pill. Apparently she was very, very strict, and she used George often as a single mother. She used him often as her nursemaid. Take care of your younger brothers and sisters. She also tried to teach him how to manage the estate that she was now managing on his behalf. So she wasn't entirely the bad guy, but she did have a bit of a reputation for keeping him under her thumb, let's say. There are letters indicating that his older brother, Lawrence, whom he adored, was trying to get him out from under her influence a little bit, but was unsuccessful. At one point, Lawrence had gotten George a commission as a midshipman in the Royal Navy. And she wrote a letter to an admiral and said, "You'll not have him. He's not coming. Don't even look for him." So his naval career was over before it started. His uncle, his mother's brother, thought that perhaps he should spend his time more wisely and learn to be a tinker. In other words, selling household goods. Not what George wanted, though. After his father died, he did, however, begin to broaden his horizons and begin to make some more acquaintances. His older brother, Lawrence, that he was very close to, courted and married Anne Fairfax. The Fairfaxes were the most powerful family in Virginia. So having his brother there in the Fairfax house was a great boon for him. He practiced those rules of civility carefully there. And in fact, he quickly became a favorite in the household. There are letters from William Fairfax to George where he signs them, "Your most assured and affectionate friend." This would not have been common in the day. It would have been far too personal. Most correspondence would be very reserved. So we know that he was well liked in the Fairfax family. And in fact, George taught himself to be a surveyor. He had the math background already. He taught himself to be a surveyor so that he could go out and survey for Lord Fairfax, for the Fairfax family. While he was out there, he was keeping an eye on potential property that he might be able to save up and buy in the future. So the relationship with the Fairfaxes was a real credit for him. But while he was in Winchester, Virginia, which is where the Fairfaxes lived, he became more and more comfortable there and spent a large portion of his time there, including during the French and Indian War. From his office here, you can go and visit this, Fred. I've not been, but Fred says it's fascinating.
Closest place you can go to see Washington stuff. It's worth doing. It's down to Winchester.
Winchester, Virginia. And you can see the office where he managed some of his French and Indian War commands. And you can see that he gave an order requiring the men under his command to attend church. The order says, "The men are to parade at the beating of the long roll tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock and march as usual to the fort to attend divine service. Officers are to be present at the roll call and to see that the men do appear in the most decent manner that they can." So the officers were to come too. So there's evidence that his mother's upbringing in that strict Anglican fashion was paying off. He was going to now make sure that his men were also doing the same. So back in this time, there were two ways for a gentleman to become a gentleman in society. One was horizontal expansion. In other words, purchase more land, become a big landholder. He was looking out for that as he was surveying. He was inheriting property from his father and adding to it. And the other one was vertical expansion. In other words, marry up, which is exactly what he did. In 1759, he married Martha Dandridge Custis, who was among the most wealthy widows in the colony. She brought with her over $30,000 in cash, an enormous amount for the time. It was pounds sterling. She also brought with her over 18,000 acres of profitable tobacco land, one of the biggest cash crops at the time, and the enslaved people to work that property. So when he made his match, he made a good match, and he was immediately driven up into the society of, the high society of the time. Most of us, however, think of Mount Vernon when we think of George Washington. This property was inherited through the Washington family. His great-grandfather, John, the preacher's kid, got this as part of a land grant in 1674. It passed down through the Washington family, not directly to George, but it eventually wound up with that Anne Fairfax Washington. Remember me talking about his older brother who died of tuberculosis before he did. He left the property to his daughter and his wife with a life residency. So it was passed to Anne Fairfax Washington, who did not live there. Instead, she rented it to George and Martha. So they were living there and in 1761, they had already started improvements. It had been a farmhouse, a 1.5-story farmhouse. They were already making improvements until it became the Mount Vernon that we know today. At Mount Vernon, it was a deeply religious home. It was quiet, orderly, and Anglican because Martha was quiet, orderly, and Anglican. She set the tone in the spiritual temperament at Mount Vernon. She had morning prayers and scripture every morning, a silent time just for her. Every evening, she read the Bible with her daughters. So Martha's faith really shaped the religion at Mount Vernon. When George was there, on the other hand, he would observe Sunday quietness. In other words, he would do no labor that was not necessary. He would join in the family prayers if there was a minister present. And he had by all accounts, a great sense of accountability to God. So this may be a case of happy wife, happy life. If Martha likes it, that's what we're doing.
How many people are like me? This is just for the guys that we married up. Now, you're smart if you put your hand up now. George Washington founded the very first Anglican church nearest his farm, Mount Vernon, the Pollock Church. He was a vestryman there all of his life. He went to church very often, he thought 16 times a year. And the Anglicans at that time had communion once a month. And George would come to church and leave before communion. Never took communion.
In public.
Now, James would never do this, but the preacher called him up or went out to see him and said, "You're leaving before communion. You shouldn't be doing that." So George stopped going to church on Communion Sunday altogether. He did seem to go to church more during times of political stress than others. When he was in Philadelphia at the Constitutional Convention, he had a pew at Christ Church, the Anglican church there. When he was near Alexandria, Virginia, he regularly worshiped at Christ Church in Alexandria. How many people been there? Anybody? A few people. They actually have his pew there in Alexandria, and they had a big debate in the church. I'm glad I wasn't on the board, but they had a big debate on the board whether they should keep the plaques in the pew or take them out. The board eventually took them out, the good compromise. They eventually took them out and put them on the grounds outside. So they aren't in the pews anymore. But if you ask, you could probably sit in their pew. George Washington at war. And I think we're back to Sue, aren't we?
So, yes. So we talked a little bit about George growing up, his development, and where he attended church. But the truth is, the proof is in the pudding. How did he act when he was out on his own? How can you be more out on your own than to be at war against the British? So during the war, he urged his troops to rely upon the goodness of the cause and the aid of the Supreme Being, in whose hand our victory lies. So he was calling upon God. He didn't use the word God, he used Supreme Being. And they say that his prayers were answered, or that he was heard by God. And some of the things that people will reference are at the fog during the Battle of New York in Brooklyn that covered his troop movements and allowed him to get away in that case. The ice and freezing rain on the Christmas night that he crossed the Delaware, and the fact that he was able to do that, to cross that river without being detected and win the battle at Trenton. Also, during the French and Indian War, it was noted that at the Battle of Monongahela, that 2 horses were shot out from under him. There were bullet holes in his coat, some say as many as 4, and that officers standing right next to him were shot dead, yet he survived without a scratch. So the view was God had other plans in mind for George Washington, that God heard his prayers for safety, and therefore he was rewarded.
You know what the last thing that George Washington said to his men before they crossed the Delaware?
Get in the boat.
Get in the boat.
I swear we didn't rehearse that. We noted before in one of the earlier classes that Washington did appoint chaplains for each one of his divisions in the Revolutionary War, and he attended those chaplain services with his men, as he required all of his officers to do. Remember the earlier directive from Winchester. So there is evidence that he was relying upon God, just as we might expect. So one of George Washington's accomplishments, one of the things that we talked about, was presiding over the Constitutional Convention. At that Constitutional Convention, there were maybe 3, maybe 4 people who thought that the convention proceedings should be opened in prayer, just as it had been during the Continental Congress. So the idea was brought up actually by Benjamin Franklin and brought before the convention. They never actually voted on this. There's no evidence that the prayers were actually said because there was no money to pay a chaplain. It's not like anybody could pray, right? But George Washington was said to have been supportive of the idea primarily because he did not say anything against it. Actually, he did not say anything at all, which was kind of his way. He allowed the debate to go on around him and generally did not comment on the debate that was happening. So, Washington as president was set some precedents, as we said before, many precedents that were lasting, one of which was to go to church immediately following inauguration. So he left and had both his Congress follow him to St. Paul's Chapel in Manhattan. It's that chapel that survived the 9/11 attack. Yeah, it's that same chapel. At that time, it would have been an Anglican chapel. And he went there to pray, and he did it consciously. It was a pre-planned event, perhaps the first president's prayer service, if you will. He did it in order to set that precedence of bringing God into our leaders' future decisions. So the inaugural procession trooped on down there, and they all prayed together right after he was inaugurated. Now, most presidents have attended religious services at some point on their inaugural day. Not all, but most have followed his precedents that he set. So, one other idea or thing to look at was Washington's involvement in the Masons. Back in the 1750s and 60s, the Masons were much more oriented toward Christian values and Christianity than they are today. Today, they're a fraternal organization. Well, they were then, but they're much less oriented towards strict Christianity. At this time, Masonry, being a Mason, was religious in character, even though it was a fraternal order. He joined at the age of 20 and rose quickly through the ranks. He was very proud of his Masonic background and his time there. He practiced the Masonic principles all his life, some of which were belief in that supreme being, moral and personal virtues, belief in your personal improvement, brotherly love or fraternal love. In fact, the Masons believe that all men are equal, regardless of your rank or your station in life. Charity, integrity, honesty, obedience to the law, and good citizenship. Those were all virtues that Washington cherished. So we're back to the question, is George Washington, or was George Washington, a Christian? So was he an Orthodox Christian? Was he a deist? We presented some ideas. What do you think?
It falls to me to present the other side. Sue mentioned the Constitutional Convention. Well, historians do not agree that they talked about prayer or had prayer or just didn't get it because they had a chaplain. They were secularist. They didn't think government ought to have anything to do with religion other than setting the basic moral standards of the society. So they didn't have prayer until the final session when Ben Franklin, a well-known deist who didn't believe in Christian dogma or doctrine, stood up and said, well, I guess we better have prayer because we can't get you all together any other way. But it was kind of okay, I'll give in and have some prayer. But the difference between them, traditional faith emphasizes dogma and doctrine in Scripture, right? Enlightenment faith, which is the other side of this coin, emphasizes the avoidance of dogma. Nothing that anybody has to believe. The Christian point of view is that the clergy have authority. Not around like here, like with Christian, our minister has no authority at all, but the minister had authority, bishops had authority. On the other side, the Enlightenment side, they thought everybody's denominations was okay, any religion was all right. There was an emphasis on personal piety in the Christian faith. George Washington's personal piety came instead, those historians argue, from his Masonic influence and from those rules of civility that were not religious in nature. The traditional Christian faith has God intervening in history. The Enlightenment faith says it's natural law. God started the world, but after that, he ignores us. God ignores us. We won't talk about whether God's male or female today. Belief in revelation, in other words, where do you get your ideas? From input from God or from your own reason and authority? The Enlightenment was that period of time that people said reason is the focus. Here's the arguments that say that Sue was right. During his lifetime, he was always an Episcopalian. He believed in the intervention of God because he always talked about God enabled him to win this battle or get by that. His belief in the incarnation of Jesus, which is not an Enlightenment point of view. He was active in the church. He had official public prayers. He called for fasting, and he appointed chaplains, remember from last week, for every unit. But on the same time, there are those that argue that he was a deist. During his lifetime, people were unsure of the degree to which Washington himself believed in Christianity. In the papers, there's a big debate back and forth whether George Washington was Christian or not. He rarely took communion. Historians would suggest, some would suggest, that he didn't take communion because he didn't believe in the suffering sacrifice of Jesus Christ for your sin. He was always using deist language to talk about God. God was the supreme being, the architect of the universe. Those are all things that come out of the Enlightenment understanding of things. And he never referred to Jesus Christ in his conversation. Patrick Henry, who some of you know, said the most important thing in his will was to leave the Christian faith to his kids. Washington didn't say that at all. So, truth is, pays your money and you takes your choice. Was George Washington a Christian or a deist? My answer is yes. He was a complex person. If you want to go one way, you can read over here by this guy that he was a deist. If you want to go in the other direction, read over here about sacred fire and how he was a Christian. This is my favorite cartoons. I cut it out of the paper just for this class. The Vikings, having agreed to join and eliminate their common enemy. But sire, one of them says, who poses greater danger than the barbarians? And the king answered, the historians. So, it's been a debate all along between both sides. I don't know who you're going to say wins. I'm guessing you don't know enough to decide, but if you read some, you might actually see. You see, one of the things that happens to us, there's a saying is, where you sit is where you stand. Where you sit is where you stand. In other words, we're always looking for arguments that confirm our point of view, and we try not to listen to any arguments that challenge our point of view. So where we sit, where we come in, the context of who we are, determines how we're going to answer a lot of the historical lessons. No question that he always talked about providence instead of God. Providence was God that is the providence of history. He always talked about religious tolerance. Very famous letter to the Jewish congregation in Rhode Island, where he says, in America, there is no place for bigotry, no sanction against religion. I mean, it couldn't be any more enlightenment than that. Good citizenship was the focus of what he was looking for. He believed that religion provided the moral values that were required for a democracy. If you're not educated, the democracy will not work. That's why we wouldn't let any women vote for a long time.
No.
Wrong crowd here.
Wrong crowd. He believed in social unity and public virtue. Those were all critical factors. So I think you can say that he believed in morality, but when it came to the transcendent values of God and Christian faith, that he was resistive of those.
Can I pop in?
You can rebut if you'd like.
Oh, I'm not rebutting. It's just my personal opinion. I think that George Washington, I'm going to engage in a little bit of pop psychology on George Washington. I think personally that George Washington was a man divided within himself. I think his mother and his wife had a great influence on him, and they had great influence on his religious practices and what he believed, whether he wanted to admit it or not. Equally, I think that he was a bit insecure about the fact that he had never received that classical education that so many of the elite society of his time had received. And so I think he was desperate to fit in with those elite leaders who had received that education. And so he wanted to be an enlightened gentleman. He wanted to follow exactly what they were saying. He wanted to be a deist. I think he was a man who was very split in his beliefs. Now, I'm not inside George's head, I don't know. But that's my belief, is that he's a complex man because he's torn within himself.
And you'd be glad to know that when we finished this, we both agreed that he was a complex guy. And this is pretty hard to decide, and we're not smart enough to do so. He did die, on his deathbed, his secretary wrote down everything that happened during that time. He caught pneumonia out riding and came back and was suffering for a couple of days, and they wrote down the whole thing. And the last thing he said, his last words were not "help me, Lord," or "take me, Lord." It was simply, "'Tis well, 'tis well, 'tis well." He's buried at Mount Vernon. If you've been there, you probably at least walked by, looked through the bars and saw him. They don't shoot you, I don't think, if you try and get in. But after his death, however, he became almost like a god. Sue's going to talk about that.
So yeah, there was this whole movement after he died in the very last year, in 1799, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, but there was this whole movement after his death, primarily happening in 1830 to like mid-1860s, where he became larger than life. I mean, you can see he's actually almost deified. You can see on some of these things, some of these paintings. He was revered as a founding father, but he became almost mythic, kind of semi-divine national symbol, if you will. And the process was accelerated after his death. I mean, before his death, people were already looking at him as a great man, the father of our country. But it just began to snowball after his death and became a rampant thing. So he was a godlike national figure, even by 1860, let's say. He was not just the father of our country. He was a transcendent, almost celestial figure. You can see him like surrounded by angels in the middle portrait. This is a very famous portrait. It can be found in the Capitol. If you look up to the dome of the Capitol, you'll see this painting. It's George Washington in the heavens, ruling over the heavens. He's surrounded, you can only see the edge, but he's surrounded by 13 maidens, which represent the 13 colonies. And if you look real closely down at his feet, you can see a rainbow symbolizing the new beginning, the new nation, and the new beginning for America. Around that, there's other tableaus that you can see. This one happens to be of his victorious war, victorious war efforts. So he was enthroned here and wearing the purple robe of Roman triumph. So you can see that he was really seen as a godlike figure. So there were a lot of myths about him going around. You probably heard the cherry tree, right? I cannot tell a lie. He supposedly took his little hatchet as a young boy, chopped down the cherry tree, And his father was incensed, wanted to know what happened, who did this. And George stepped up and said, I cannot tell a lie. The only problem is it never happened. As a matter of fact, this was part of right after his death in 1800, a gentleman named Parson Weems wrote a factual biography of George Washington. And at that point, it was just the facts, ma'am. You know, it was pretty much a chronological description of George's life. However, as publishers are wont to do, they wanted to sell more books. So they kept selling out and making revisions and selling more books. By the time they got to the 5th revision, not the first, the 5th revision, they said, okay, I have a great idea. We'll include his boyhood in there and we'll make this up. It was entirely made up, the whole I cannot tell a lie. And it didn't make it into the book until the 5th revision of the book. So that's just one of the larger than life stories.
I just wanted to let you know that my father had George Washington's axe. Now, my great-great-grandfather had to replace the wooden handle, and my great-grandfather had to replace the head of the axe. But I had George Washington's axe.
I can't believe that we don't pay him for this. So Ron Chernow has written a book. I found this fascinating. Speaking of larger than life, has written a book called Washington a Life, and in it, you know, one of the stories that we all know and believe is that Washington was the largest man in the room. He was larger than life. He was 6'2", 6'3". No. Ron Chernow found out by looking at his tailor's notes that in fact George Washington was 6 foot. That the reason why we think that he was 6'2" or 6'3" is that they measured him on his deathbed. And so he was lying down and his feet, you know, instead of when you're standing up, his feet were kind of like this. And they measured him toe to the top of his head. So he got a couple of extra inches that way. In fact, there were others taller than him in the room, but he had such a commanding presence that he seemed to be the largest man in the room. Another story, that you may have heard, is that George Washington threw a silver dollar across the Potomac River. Didn't happen. First of all, the silver dollar wasn't minted at the time. Second of all, the Potomac River, where he would have been, they might have been trying to refer to, is about a mile wide down there near Pope's Creek. Now, potentially, it could have happened at Ferry Farm, that farm where he and his mother were managing the estate. There, the river is is about 90 yards wide. And Walter Johnson, who is perhaps the greatest baseball pitcher of all time, we can argue about that later, was able to throw a silver dollar across the river there at Ferry Farm in 1936, a little before my time. But it could be done. There are some accounts in his family's lore that says, okay, it wasn't a silver dollar, it was a rock, but we don't know if it ever actually happened or not. This didn't happen either. This is another invention of Pastor Weems about him kneeling in the snow at Valley Forge. We know that Martha had joined him there. She might have made him kneel in the snow, possibly, but it didn't really happen. There was a whole, a drive to make him seem like the perfect leader for our nation, the perfect Christian leader for our nation. So it was a time of war. He did call upon Providence to help him in his efforts, but there is no record of him kneeling in the snow. This portrait was kind of made up after the fact, and it was perpetuated. These are all copies of stamps, and every one of them, George is kneeling, praying to God. This is an example of how our persistence in making sure that people believe what we want them to believe or how we perceive somebody to be. So he's outlived the factual basis, and has become our leader spiritually also.
Now, here's some other things that you didn't know. For example, George Washington became a Baptist before he was. This guy claims that John Gallo, Baptist preacher, that he baptized George Washington. Well, no historical record of that either. You Baptists probably like that idea. It probably sounds good for us disciples, but we don't think that's true. For you former Catholics, he was Catholic. On his deathbed, they sent over to the monastery near his house for this priest who came and converted him to Catholicism. We don't have any record of that. We do have a lot of monuments. Y'all know where the first monument was? Yeah, right here in Washington County. It's this one at the top left. If you've never been up there and hiked that hill, it's worth doing. Very interesting place. If you want to really see an interesting place, go down to Alexandria and go to the Masonic Temple. They give tours. They have Washington rooms and memorabilia. It's fascinating. Monuments to George everywhere, and of course the one that you know, the Washington Monument. Unfortunately, isn't getting reflected these days, but a lot of things named after George Washington. One state, 31 countries, 241 civil townships, 10 colleges, 100 towns, dozens of forts, many natural features like Mount Washington, and many famous people. It was very good. People went through a period of time when they loved to name their children after famous people. Debbie has a bunch of United Brothered people in her background, and they are all named either Thomas Jefferson Eckethorn or George Washington Eckethorn, the whole batch of them. They had, 16 children or whatever. So, but anyway, lots of interesting stuff. Here's some quotes of what he wrote. This one didn't happen,
Hit it twice.
and that's it. Now, I would tell you, I have one more thing to tell you, and that is next week, we are going to talk about the more traditional Christian founding fathers. But you're not allowed to come next week if you don't come to the following week, which one we're going to talk about the Enlightenment founding fathers. Somebody told me this week, I can't wait till you get to Thomas Jefferson. So you can learn about how we have harmonized our beliefs and are still talking to each other. See you next week.